Hey, what's up, y'all? It's Koski. Fun day back at it once again. Kicking this for you and for yours. And we're going back into the series about Africa, World War II in Africa and stuff like that. You know, that's the name of the series. And this is a part two about it, to give more of a backdrop. You know what I'm saying? Because my people say it's good research, but I'm going to try to give more of a backdrop to it. And also, too, I found a book on the subject, too, that's going to have some very, very interesting stuff that's going to help make the series and make this one of the better series that I ever did. So hopefully you like, subscribe to the channel, you know what I'm saying? Donate to the movement. And without further ado, we're going to get into this. This comes from Azukla News, the voice of freedom and justice. Forgotten African soldiers in World War II celebrations. Now remember, we talking about World War II in Africa. So you know what I'm saying? This deal with the continent, okay? So this is not about the Tuskegee Airmen or no stuff like that. Much respect and love to them and stuff like that. We're the 761, tank battalion that served under General Patton. This is about, African soldiers on the continent. This came out June. This is by Gary Bushing. It came out June 18, 2014. More than 1 million African soldiers were engaged in this war, some as volunteers, while most of them were forcibly conscripted. Meaning they was forced to serve. They was drafted or just put into slavery. They fought in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the Far East, but their contribution remains unacknowledged. The forgotten African soldiers in World War II celebrations. In the recent D-Day landings and multiple recollections of the aged participants in the battles of weathered the war issued a period of recollection of horrors of that war and bravery of participants, particularly by the survivors. Celebrities of both Axis and the Allied powers were there, even the French, Russians, and Italians who fought on both sides of the war. The ones who were missing were the valiant African soldiers who fought and died in these same battles, served at the front, and perished in prisoner of war camps. Their heroism and dedication went unnoticed and unregarded. This is a pity and a great shame for the host of these celebrations. It should have been no surprise to the Africans, however, as their treatment after the war was a triumph of racism and discriminatory behavior towards them and those whose homelands the Africans fought to save. These African soldiers were many and ubiquitous. They fought in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the Far East, especially in Burma and Cyclone in India. There were over 1 million African soldiers engaged in this war. For them, the war started in its very beginning, not the attack on Poland, which triggered a European response in 1939, but even early in 1935 when fascist troops backed by African soldiers from Eritrea attacked Ethiopia. African troops were engaged in this war as a result of colonial occupation of their countries and the compulsion of the colonial powers on the colonies to provide manpower for the war effort. Some were volunteers, but most were compelled to become soldiers. Each colonial power had a different method of conscription, but the end result was the same. In his book, Fighting for Britain, African Soldiers in the Second World War, historian David Canary says more than 500,000 African troops served with British forces between 1939 and 1945. 289,000 and 5,300 of them with the King's African Army Rifles from Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Malawi. He described it as the largest single movement of African men across seas since the slave trade. Most Africans were told they had no choice. They were told they must fight and were picked up by army trucks from their home villages and sent to basic trainings, often with the complicity of the native chief and the district supervisors. The Belgians just ran them whoever they saw and dropped them off at a local army base, usually after some initial brutality. The French had created a body of African soldiers earlier. Since 1857, the French colonialists tried to create a segregated army of African soldiers of Africans living in several states composed of the AOF, French West Africa, and the AEF, French Equatorial Africa. They called these soldiers the Tringalese, although they weren't limited to the inhabitants of Senegal. The Tringalese were created as the first permanent union of Black African soldiers under French rule in 1857. These were not professional soldiers. They were drawn from the ranks of ex-slaves and social outcasts who were sold to the French by local African slave chiefs. From 1857 to 1905, The main recruiting of soldiers was the ratchet system, which slaves were purchased from their local owners by the French and turned into mercenary soldiers. The practice of buying slaves by the army officially ended in 1882, but it was much observed for a much a breach than observance. In 1905, the French colonies in Africa were put under civilian rule rather than military. However, this removal of the French military rule of the region meant that more African proxies were needed for policing, fighting resistant forces, and as a garrison of troops. These surrogate troops were used to put down local uprisings and expand French rule. The Trail Senegalese participated in the conquest of Morocco in the early 1900s. In 1912, a new partial conscription law was passed, making it easier for French to recruit surrogates. With the French entering the World War I, these Trail Senegalese were sent to Europe to defend France. A number of West African troops serving under French command in World War I comprised of 170,000 men, and approximately 30,000 of them were killed. In Senegal alone, 1/3 of all the males of military age are mobilized and sent to France to fight. After the war, the French colonial authorities passed a conscription law in 1919, which called for the universal male conscription in peacetime as well as wartime. Hundreds of thousands of Trail Senegalese were compelled to fight in France's colonial wars and provide labor brigades for the colonial authorities. During World War II, these African troops played an important role. The Trail Senegalese troops were used in even greater number, initially by Vichy France, and later by the Free French. In 1940, the African troops comprised roughly 9% of the French army. The French recruited more than 200,000 Black Africans during the war. Approximately 25,000 were killed in battle. Many were also interned in German labor camps, and thousands of Black African prisoners of war, POW, was murdered by the Wehrmacht in 1940. One of those who escaped execution was later President of Senegal, Leopold Senghor. Despite his high level of education and acquiescence of French citizenship in 1932, Senghor was enrolled as a French enlisted man. In 1939, with the rank of private within the 59th Colonial Infantry Division. A year later, during the German occupation of France, he was taken prisoner by the Germans and kept in several internment camps. He ended up in front of Stalag 230 at Pointers, which served as a reserve for colonial troops. It was there the Germans engaged in mass execution of African prisoners of war. The main sport of the German guards at that camp was to randomly pick out their African prisoners almost daily and take them out to a field for tiger practice. Literally thousands were killed this way. Senghor escaped by the skin of his teeth. Senghor was lucky to avoid daily executions. He was released for medical reasons in 1942 and went back to Senegal and his unit. He was there sent with his unit to Algiers as a part of the French war against Algerian nationalists. He recounted some of his experience in his famous book of poetry, Nasa Nuez, or Black Host, published in 1948. It is a second collection of Senghor. The poet recounts his painful experience of war and labor camps, painful because of the physical violence and also contempt shown by his friend and foe to the Black man. His first verse sings of the struggle. Not only was it difficult to be taken away far from home and placed in great dangers in the front line, but the French was divided between Vichy and Free France. Both large campaigns had large contingents of African troops. The French were happy to use African troops against other African troops. The best example of this is Operation Explorer. Sidebar, we're going to do a separate video on Operation Explorer, but this is going to give it kind of what the overlay, what happened to it, you know what I'm saying? But we're going to do a separate video on that. During World War II, during the Second World War, the Germans concentrated the Central Asian policies on supporting the regime of Rashid Ali and the colonels of the Golden Square in Iraq. They were trying to block British access to India and the oil supplies from Iraq, then under British influence. In the spring of 1941, the French government, Vichy, granted permission for German and Italian aircraft to refuel in the Levant en route to Iraq. The French were still mandated rulers of Syria and Lebanon. The British were urged by the Free French under Charles de Gaulle to intervene against Vichy France. British forces in the Middle East under WWII invaded Syria and Lebanon for Palestine and Transjordan on Sunday, 8th June 1941, with columns arriving from Iraq later in the campaign under code name Operation Exporter. At that time, the Allies were the only member of the British Commonwealth. The Soviet Union had not been invaded, and Japan had yet to bomb Pearl Harbor. These allies participated quickly in the knockout, quick knockout, followed by immediate rally of Vichy forces to Free French. This did not happen. Although Vichy forces were small and without significant reserves of supplies, their ground force was tough and well trained, and their small air force usually maintained a high air superiority for much of the campaign. Instead of a quick victory, the Australian, Indian, British, and Free French forces slugged out with the Vichy French defenders and suffered several serious setbacks before the ceasefire of the 12th of July. The reason that the Free French and the Vichy French showed such valor was that they were both made up of Signalese troops and foreign legionnaires. So they just put the black troops to fight against the other black troops they had. There were very few French actually involved, free or otherwise. By July, most of the Free French forces and the Vichy forces, especially the Senegalese, had enough of killing their countrymen and refused to continue. When the campaign ended with an Allied victory, only some 5,700 out of 26,000 Vichy troops elected to join de Gaulle. The remainder was evacuated by sea to the French North African coast under Allied supervision. The Senegalese were tired of fighting other Senegalese and went home. The war in the Lebanon was much quicker as the French soldiers quit after 6 days because they had ran out of Senegalese. An armistice was signed in Acre on July 14, 1941. The war in Europe and large numbers of African soldiers continued to die. By late 1944, it became clear that actual victory was unlikely. It was a matter of time before the invasion of the German heartland would end Germany's defeat. The Italians was already changed sides, and de Gaulle was the installer of the leader of the Free French. Vichy had disappeared. De Gaulle and his generals decided it was time to whiten up the French army. They extended their gratitude to the African soldiers, who was returning to West Africa in 1944 after the liberation of France. De Gaulle, when he saw that the Allies had pushed the Germans out of France, decided it was too dangerous to continue the use of these African troops. He ordered a whitening up of the troops by replacing 20,000 Africans, which was in battle in the front line with white French soldiers. This event caused a hatred and dislike between white and blacks at the war. These Senegalese troops were segregated in French demobilizing centers waiting to go back home. And while at these centers, the African soldiers faced discriminatory treatment. They barely got any food and resources they needed and did not have any kind of shelter. The French refused to pay the money they owed them and informed them that as they weren't French, they would not be entitled to any pensions or benefits which would contribute to the liberation of France. They were then transported out of France to a holding camps in Africa, Benin, Dakar, and Senegal. In December 1944, humiliated and while being given what they were promised, the soldiers at the Camp Toivering protest for back pay which they were entitled to. The protest was seen by the French as a defiance against the French military and the general in charge. And with the help of the Grenadier, ordered the white French infantry military to deploy their machine guns and open fire on the African soldiers, which resulted in 35 Africans killed and hundreds wounded and many sent to jail. It is known as the WWII Massacre. Sidebar, we're going to have something on that too. I found some things on that, and we're going to speak on that too about what they did, what the French did to them. You know what I'm saying? It is just not in any French book because it's forgotten among African soldiers. There is a good film on the subject by Omar Simpson, Canty Grand made in 1988. Despite this, the Senegalese were compelled by the French to participate in the French counterinsurgency war in Algiers in 1950, fighting Algerian nationalists. Sidebar on that one, that's the war that you hear about France Fanon coming out of. You know what I'm saying? France Fanon was one of these so-called Senegalese troops, you know what I'm saying? This gave birth to a lot of things in a Pan-African movement in French Africa too, when you look later on. All right, back to it. The French felt obligated to use African troops in Algiers because large number of Algerian troops who had fought for France was outraged at the behavior of the French on WWII Day 1945, where 45,000 of their relatives and countrymen were massacred in one weekend. On May 8th, 1945, a day chosen by the Allies to celebrate victory over Nazi Germany, thousands of Algerians gathered near Abu Dhabi Mosque in Safrita for a peaceful march, for which the Souls Parade had been given permission. It was a market day. At 9 a.m., led by young scout Salah Boudiz, whose names had been drawn for honor for carrying the national flag, the demonstration set off. Minutes later, the crowd chanting "Viva Independence" and other national slogans came under fire from troops commanded by General de Gaulle and brought in from Constantine. Salah fell dead and becoming a national martyr. The scene soon turned to a massacre. The streets and the houses were being littered with dead bodies. Witnesses claimed terrible scenes that the legionnaires seized babies by their feet and dashed their head against the rocks, that pregnant mothers were disemboweled, and the soldiers dropped grenades down chimneys killing the occupants of the home, that the mourners were machine gunned while taking the dead to the cemetery. A public record states that the European inhabitants were so frightened by the events that they asked all those responsible for the protest movement should be shot. The carnage spread. In the days that followed, some 45,000 Algerians were killed. Villages were shelled by artillery, and remote hamlets were bombed with aircraft. A colonel in charge of the burials, being criticized for slowness, told another officer, "We are killing them faster than I can bury them." These incidents led to the upward surge of the PPA, and ultimately, 17 years later, to the country's independence. In retaliatory violence that immediately followed, 104 Europeans were assassinated, but by the end, several thousands were to die. These incidents was particularly hard for the Algerian terrorism, who had fought the Nazis alongside French forces, some of whom had came home to find their families had been decimated by the troops of Charles de Gaulle. Perhaps of these memories, the French barbarism, which had prevented access of the African troops to the ceremony celebrating the 70th anniversary. The troops fared a bit better under British rule, but they too returned to a colonial system in which they found it hard to rejoin their former lives. The British too were not forthcoming with their pensions, and they had earned, and occasionally, as in Ghana in 1948, the British response to a protest of African soldiers that had not received their back pay, instructing the police force to open fire on the protesters. Sidebar on that one. If you read Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah, he talks about this. This what got the Gold Coast movement started. You know what I'm saying? This right here. You know, it got it really, really back jumping on flying. You know. So that's just a sidebar that we might add that to the thing, we might not. To the series, we might not. The African wrenched from their homes by colonial conscription laws, the ratchet, and kidnapped, fought bravely, and well during the Second World War. It was a pity and a shame that their contribution to the war effort, marked in lives lost, injuries suffered, and harsh conditions, should go on allowed unrecognized at the ceremonies. Not one African country was invited to participate. It's an insult to the memory of these brave African soldiers. So there you have it. There's a quick backdrop right there. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, we're going to look into a couple of those about the massacres and stuff like that that occurred to the African French soldiers once they said they didn't want to fight no more. And they got their pensions. They want to get their pension for free in France. It's a well-known fact. It was not really well-known that the white French soldiers didn't really free in the battle of Paris. They really didn't free France like that. You know what I'm saying? Even though they marching in and stuff like that. De Gaulle made the black soldiers get in the back. It was the black soldiers that fought and opened up Paris that, did that. We gonna check into that. We got videos on that too. But we gotta look at this. Our brothers and sisters in the continent in World War II in Africa, the battles they went through. As we talked about the battle of Operation Explorer, we're gonna look into that, into the massacre and things of that nature. You know what I'm saying? But both sides use black soldiers. You know what I'm saying, from Africa. Anyway, hit the like button. Hey, donate to the movement. You know what I'm saying? All off the Cash App Akoski. Show some love, you know what I'm saying? And we're going to keep on growing this channel and keep on spending this Black history. God have a wonderful one. Peace.